For a long time, Bigfoot existed on the fringe of belief, dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. But over the years, certain encounters and findings have refused to disappear. Some cases are detailed enough that they continue to resist simple explanations. In this episode, we will examine the most shocking real Bigfoot evidence ever recorded and why it still unsettles those who look into it. Dr. Lyra Wen had been conducting routine botanical surveys in the Bluff Creek region in April of 2015, but she wasn't there under ordinary circumstances. For the past 8 months, the Forest Service had quietly asked specialists like her to document unusual environmental disturbances: vegetation crushed in clustered patterns, tree bark stripped in vertical swaths, soil churned as if by large bipedal movement, anomalies found near the last known locations of more than 100 missing hunters. Lyra wasn't a tracker, but her field work often placed her in remote pockets others didn't reach, and her reports had become one of the few consistent data points the investigation still relied on. The first anomaly that day occurred at 2:47, though Lyra said she hadn't recognized it as significant until much later. She had been photographing a fern when she noticed the forest had gone quiet. A stillness that suggested something large was present, something the ecosystem itself reacted to. She decided to relocate to a different survey site, one closer to established trails where human scent markers might provide psychological comfort, even if they offered no real protection. Her goal was simply to get back to ground other researchers had recently passed through, areas where every missing hunter's trail had abruptly ended. That was when she heard the first footfall. Was it just another one of the missing hunters, or something else entirely? It came from behind her, perhaps 40 feet back, a heavy impact that suggested significant mass. Lyra turned immediately, scanning the forest, but saw nothing beyond the usual tangle of ferns, fallen logs, and vertical tree trunks. She waited, listening. If this was connected to the pattern she'd been monitoring, she knew she had already stayed in one place too long. Then another footfall, this time slightly closer and offset to her left. The sound was distinct, not the 4-point gait of a bear or the lighter tread of a deer, but something bipedal, something walking upright with a stride length that suggested a creature far larger than any human. She began walking, not running, maintaining a steady pace toward what she believed was the direction of the nearest marked trail. Her GPS unit showed she was roughly 2 miles from the access road, a distance she could cover in under an hour if she maintained good speed. Behind her, the footfalls continued, matching her pace exactly. When she accelerated, they accelerated. When she slowed to navigate a fallen log, they slowed. The synchronization was too perfect to be coincidental. Her pack contained bear spray, a whistle, and a satellite emergency beacon that could summon search and rescue within hours. But hours might as well be days if something was actively pursuing her. Was she about to meet the same fate as the hunters who vanished before they ever reached their radios? She reached for the bear spray, unclipping it from her belt and holding it ready in her right hand. Behind her, the footfalls continued their measured rhythm, neither closing distance nor falling back. Whatever was following her seemed content to maintain a fixed interval, as if testing her responses or simply observing her movements. She tried to compensate, angling right toward where her mental map suggested the trail should be, but each time she adjusted her trajectory, a sharp crack would erupt from the direction she was heading, the unmistakable sound of a large branch being snapped or a tree being struck with tremendous force. Was this the same behavior that had funneled those missing hunters away from safety before they disappeared without a trace? The message was clear: do not go that way. Lyra felt her analytical mind struggling to process what was happening. Animals did not herd humans. Predators might stalk prey, might follow at a distance waiting for weakness or opportunity, but they did not actively redirect their target's movement with such obvious intentionality. Was she being pushed along the same path the 100 lost hunters had unknowingly followed? She tried breaking left, pushing through a gap in the ferns toward what looked like more open ground. Immediately, a massive shape moved in her peripheral vision, too fast to be clearly seen, but large enough to register as a wall of dark mass shifting between tree trunks. The movement was accompanied by a deep, forceful exhalation, a sound that carried both volume and what Lyra could only describe as irritation. She veered back to her original path, and the presence behind her resumed its measured pursuit. Lyra's walk became a jog, then a run. Professional caution gave way to primal fear as the full implications of her situation crystallized. She was being hunted. The thing behind her wanted her moving, wanted her going deeper, and it possessed both the physical capability and tactical awareness to ensure she had no choice but to comply. The terrain grew rougher. Moss-slick logs appeared with increasing frequency, forcing Lyra to slow her pace or risk a fall that could break an ankle, or worse. Each time she stumbled, the footfalls behind her would pause, waiting with what felt like patience for her to regain her footing. It did not want her injured. It wanted her mobile, conscious, capable of continuing. Why was it so interested in keeping her alive? Through gaps in the canopy, Lyra caught fragmentary glimpses of her pursuer, a massive shoulder covered in dark reddish-brown hair, an arm longer than any human limb swinging with a gait that was distinctly non-human, a head that seemed too large, too robust, mounted on a neck thick with muscle. The glimpses were never complete, never long enough to form a full picture, but each fragment added to a composite image that defied everything Lyra understood about North American fauna. The forest continued to funnel her leftward, always leftward, through corridors that seemed almost deliberately maintained. Lyra noticed that the undergrowth in certain areas had been cleared or trampled, creating pathways that were not quite trails, but were far more navigable than the surrounding terrain. Were these the same hidden pathways the missing hunters had unknowingly walked moments before they vanished? She tried to use her GPS unit to mark her position, but the device showed only scattered satellite coverage beneath the dense canopy. Her last reliable fix had been nearly 20 minutes ago, placing her roughly 3 miles southeast of her vehicle and moving steadily away from any marked trails. The satellite beacon remained her best option for rescue, but activating it would take time. Time to stop, time to deploy the antenna, time to wait for signal acquisition. And stopping, she knew with absolute certainty, was not something her pursuer would allow. A fallen redwood blocked her path, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter and too high to climb over quickly. Lyra veered right, looking for a way around, and immediately heard a sharp grunt from that direction, a sound that was unmistakably vocal, unmistakably intentional. She reversed course, scrambling left around the log's root system, and the pursuit resumed its steady rhythm behind her. The creature was communicating with her, Lyra realized, not through language, but through sound and position, through the careful placement of warnings and the strategic blocking of escape routes. It was teaching her the boundaries of acceptable movement, training her to respond to its cues. Was this how it had controlled the hunters before revealing what became of them? The forest began to slope downward, subtly at first, then more dramatically. Lyra found herself descending into terrain that felt older, less touched by human presence. The trees grew larger here, their trunks massive enough that 3 people linking hands could not encircle them. And still the footfalls continued behind her, relentless and measured, driving her deeper into wilderness that no longer felt like the forest she knew. Lyra's mind raced through scenarios, searching for options that might shift the dynamic in her favor. She could try to hide, but the creature had demonstrated an ability to track her movements with precision that suggested either exceptional vision or some other sensory capability she could not counter. She could try to fight, but the glimpses she had caught of her pursuer's size made that option suicidal. She could activate the emergency beacon and hope that rescue arrived before whatever was hurting her reached its destination. But that assumed her pursuer would allow her to stop long enough to deploy the device. The only option that remained was to keep moving. A creek appeared ahead, perhaps 15 feet wide and running fast with recent rainfall. Lyra splashed through without hesitation, the cold water shocking against her overheated skin. On the far bank, she paused for just a moment, listening. The footfalls had stopped. She turned, scanning the opposite shore, and saw nothing. For 5 seconds, 10, the forest remained silent and still. Was this the same silence the missing hunters heard in their final moments, right before Bigfoot showed them where he was taking them? Then the creature emerged from the tree line. It stood fully upright, easily 9 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad and arms that hung past where its knees would be. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair that appeared reddish-brown in the filtered light. The face was partially obscured by shadow and distance, but Lyra could make out a pronounced brow ridge, a flat nose, and eyes that reflected light with an amber glow. It stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that felt almost physical. For a moment, neither moved. Lyra's hand tightened on the bear spray canister, though she knew the gesture was futile. If this thing decided to cross the creek and take her, no chemical deterrent would stop it. But it did not cross. It simply stood there, allowing her to see it fully for the first time, as if the reveal was intentional, as if it wanted her to understand exactly what was herding her through the forest. Why reveal itself now? And what did it hope she understood? Then it took one step forward, and Lyra ran. The pursuit resumed with renewed intensity, but something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between hunter and prey. Lyra no longer harbored any illusions about what was following her, no comforting rationalizations about misidentified bears or tricks of light and shadow. She had seen it clearly, had locked eyes with something that should not exist. She ran harder now, driven by pure survival instinct rather than any coherent strategy. The creek crossing had bought her perhaps 30 seconds of distance, but the creature closed that gap with terrifying efficiency. She could hear it moving through the water behind her. Was this the same speed and precision that had overwhelmed the hunters who never made it out? The undergrowth showed signs of regular passage, vegetation trampled into pathways that wound through terrain no human trail crew would ever mark. This was not wilderness in any conventional sense. This was inhabited space, territory claimed and maintained by something that had lived here long enough to reshape the landscape to its needs. The silence that had marked the beginning of her ordeal had deepened into something absolute. No birds called from the canopy. No insects buzzed in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lyra had studied enough ecology to understand what such silence meant. The complete absence of prey species indicated the presence of an apex predator, so dominant that every other creature had learned to flee or hide when it moved through its territory. She was running through a dead zone, a space that other animals refused to enter. Her legs burned, and her breathing had become ragged and desperate. Lyra knew she could not maintain this pace much longer. She tried to use terrain to her advantage, descending into a steep ravine where thick vegetation might obscure her movements and hide from the creature. Could the ravine offer cover, or was it just another trap? The strategy failed immediately. As soon as she dropped below the ridgeline, she heard the creature reposition above her, its movements so swift and sure-footed that it reached a parallel position before she had covered 20 yards. Lyra scrambled up the opposite side of the ravine, her hands tearing at roots and rock for purchase. At the top, she paused for just a moment, gasping for air, and made the mistake of looking back. The creature stood on the opposite ridge, fully visible in a shaft of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. It tilted its head, studying her across the ravine, and Lyra felt a shock of recognition that went beyond fear. This thing was assessing her, measuring her remaining stamina, calculating how much farther it needed to drive her before she reached whatever destination it had in mind. The creature raised one massive arm and pointed, not at her, but past her, deeper into the forest. The gesture was unmistakable, a clear communication of direction and intent. It wanted her to keep moving, wanted her to go where it was pointing. And when Lyra hesitated, Frozen by the surreal nature of receiving directions from something that should not exist, the creature took 3 rapid steps forward and released a vocalization that shook loose needles from the trees around her. Was this the same command that had driven the missing hunters deeper before disappearing without a trace? Lyra said that the sound was like nothing she had ever heard. Too deep to be human, too structured to be animal, a rolling bellow that carried layers of meaning she could not parse but understood on an instinctive level. It was a command, a warning, and a promise of consequences if she did not comply. Terrified, she turned and ran in the direction it had pointed. The terrain continued to descend, pulling her into valleys that grew progressively narrower and more confined. The creature behind her navigated the same spaces with fluid ease, its bulk somehow compressing or angling to fit through openings that should have been impassable for something its size. She stumbled over a root hidden beneath leaf litter and went down hard, her palms scraping against rock as she tried to break her fall. Pain lanced through her left wrist, and for a moment she thought she might have fractured it. She rolled onto her back, expecting to see the creature looming over her, expecting the pursuit to end in whatever violent conclusion it had been building toward. Has her luck finally run out? But the creature had stopped. It stood 15 feet away, partially obscured by a massive fir trunk, watching her with that same measured attention. Lyra lay there, chest heaving, waiting for it to close the distance and finish whatever it had started. Seconds passed. The creature did not move. It simply watched, its breathing audible but calm, as if waiting for something. Was it judging whether she was strong enough to survive what it intended to show her, just as it had with the hunters? Then Lyra understood. It was giving her time to recover. It had seen her fall, had assessed that she was injured, and had deliberately pulled back to allow her to get up. The realization was somehow more terrifying than if it had attacked. This thing did not want her dead or incapacitated. It wanted her mobile, functional, capable of continuing. Whatever destination it was driving her toward required her to arrive intact. Lyra forced herself to stand, cradling her injured wrist against her chest. The creature watched her rise, then took a single step backward, creating more space. She continued. Her wrist throbbed with every jarring step, but the pain was manageable. Nothing compared to the exhaustion that was rapidly consuming her remaining reserves. She had been running for over 90 minutes through terrain that would have been challenging even at a walking pace. And then the forest began to change again. Was she approaching freedom or the same fate of those hunters? The trees grew more sparse, the undergrowth thinner, as if she was approaching some kind of clearing or open space. The air grew cooler and carried a smell that made Lyra's stomach clench. The sweet, rotten odor of organic decay, concentrated and unmistakable. The creature's vocalizations changed. Instead of the occasional grunt or exhale, it began producing a series of sharp staccato sounds, almost like clicks or pops, but deeper, resonating from somewhere in its massive chest. The rhythm was urgent, insistent, as if it was communicating something important. Behind those sounds, Lyra thought she heard something else. A response, perhaps, from somewhere ahead of her. The possibility that there might be more than one of these things, that she might be running toward others rather than away from a single pursuer, sent fresh adrenaline flooding through her exhausted system. Was she about to stumble into an ambush, or a greater revelation? The ground began to slope more dramatically downward, the angle steep enough that Lyra had to slow her pace or risk tumbling forward out of control. Loose soil and leaf litter made every step treacherous, and she found herself half running, half sliding down an incline that seemed to have no bottom. The creature behind her kept pace effortlessly, its footfalls now coming in rapid succession as it descended the slope with the confidence of something that had traveled this exact route countless times before. Lyra tried to stop, tried to dig her heels in and arrest her downward momentum, but the slope was too steep and the ground too unstable. She was committed now, sliding toward whatever lay at the bottom, whether she wanted to or not. The creature seemed to sense her resistance and released another of those deep, commanding vocalizations. But this time the sound carried a different quality. Not warning or threat, but something that almost sounded like urgency, as if it needed her to reach the bottom quickly, as if time was suddenly a factor in whatever plan it had been executing. What could be waiting for her at the bottom that made speed so critical? A boulder came loose from somewhere above her, tumbling down the slope with gathering momentum. Lyra threw herself sideways, barely avoiding the rock as it crashed past her and disappeared into the shadows below. She looked back up the slope and saw the creature standing at the top, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the canopy. It had not thrown the boulder, she was certain of that, but it had used the rock's movement to reinforce its message. Keep going, do not stop, and reach the bottom. The slope became a chute, a natural funnel of mud and decomposing vegetation that offered no handholds and no way to control her descent. Lyra gave up trying to maintain her footing and simply let gravity take her, sliding and tumbling through the muck as the world spun around her in a chaos of earth and shadow. She hit the bottom hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping in a heap of mud and leaf litter. For several seconds, she could not move, could not think beyond the immediate need to breathe. She lay there in the darkness at the bottom of the chute, waiting for her vision to clear, waiting for her lungs to remember how to function. Was this the place where the missing hunters had vanished without a trace? Then her hand sank into something that was not mud. Lyra's fingers had pushed through fabric, old rotted fabric that tore at her touch. Beneath the fabric was something rigid, something that her scientific training immediately identified as bone. She jerked her hand back and scrambled to her feet, her eyes adjusting to the dim light enough to see what surrounded her. Bodies? The ravine floor was covered with them. Dozens of human remains in various stages of decomposition, some reduced to scattered bones and scraps of clothing, others more recent, still recognizable as the people they had been. Hunting gear lay scattered among the remains. Rifles, knives, backpacks, boots. The smell that had been growing stronger during her descent was overwhelming now, a concentrated reek of death that made her gag and stumble backward. Lyra's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This was not a natural accumulation of lost hikers or accident victims. The bodies were too numerous, too concentrated in this single location, and the ravine itself was too remote, too difficult to reach by accident. These people had been brought here, deposited in this hidden chasm by something that had hunted them through the forest, the same way it had hunted her. What creature could do this, and why? This was a dumping ground, a killing field, a place where something disposed of the humans it caught in its territory. A sound from above made her look up. The creature was descending into the ravine, moving with careful precision down the steep walls. It reached the bottom and straightened to its full height, towering over her in the confined space. Lyra pressed herself against the ravine wall, her hand fumbling for the bear spray that she had somehow managed to keep clipped to her belt throughout the chase. But the creature did not attack. Instead, it approached her slowly, its movements deliberate and non-threatening. It stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Lyra could see the details of its face, the deep-set eyes, the flat nose, the mouth that seemed too wide, too expressive. It studied her for a long moment, then did something that shattered every assumption Lyra had made about her situation. It reached down, gently, and lifted her. The creature's hands were enormous, easily capable of crushing her ribs or snapping her spine, but they held her with surprising delicacy, as if she were something fragile that required careful handling. It raised her up and set her down among the bodies, positioning her carefully, almost reverently. Then it stepped back and simply watched her, its head tilted in what looked like expectation. Why bring her here, and why reveal the truth behind the missing hunters to her of all people? Lyra stood frozen among the dead. The creature had chased her for miles, had herded her with precision and intelligence, had driven her into this ravine of corpses. But it had not killed her. It had not harmed her beyond the injuries she had sustained during the chase itself. It had brought her here for a reason, had positioned her among the bodies as if she was supposed to see them, supposed to understand something about this place. It wanted her to witness this. But why? The creature continued to watch her, its breathing steady, its posture relaxed. It was waiting for something, expecting some kind of response or reaction that Lyra could not begin to guess. She looked around at the bodies surrounding her, at the decades of victims that had been accumulated in this hidden ravine, and felt a horror that went beyond fear of death. This thing could have been hunting humans for years, perhaps decades, and it had brought her here to show her the results. What kind of mind, human or otherwise, could maintain such a legacy? The remains varied dramatically in age and condition. Some were little more than scattered bones, bleached white by time, and the elements that managed to penetrate into the ravine. Others were more recent, still clothed in modern synthetic fabrics that had resisted decay better than the flesh they covered. She identified at least 3 bodies that could not have been here more than a few months, based on the degree of decomposition and the condition of their gear. The victims were predominantly male, predominantly equipped with hunting rifles and outdoor gear that suggested they had been in the forest deliberately. Why were these hunters specifically targeted, and what did they do to draw its attention? Then she noticed something else that made her skin crawl. Many of the bodies had been arranged, positioned with a care that went beyond simply dumping corpses into a convenient location. Some lay in neat rows, their limbs straightened, and their gear placed beside them in organized piles. The attention to detail suggested ritual or ceremony, behaviors that implied symbolic thinking far beyond what any known animal should possess. The creature watching her shifted its weight, and Lyra's attention snapped back to the immediate threat. It remained at the same distance, making no move to approach or retreat, but something in its posture had changed. Its head was cocked at a slight angle, and its eyes, those disturbingly intelligent eyes, were fixed not on her, but on something beyond her, up toward the rim of the ravine. Lyra followed its gaze, but saw nothing except the steep walls and the tangle of vegetation that obscured the forest above. Then she heard it. A vocalization rolled across the forest canopy, deep and resonant, carrying a tonal quality that was distinctly different from the sounds her pursuer had made. This was lower, more sustained, almost questioning in its cadence. The creature beside her went rigid, every muscle in its massive frame tensing as if preparing for confrontation. It released a soft huffing sound, barely audible, that Lyra's exhausted mind interpreted as distress or concern. Were the creatures responsible for the missing hunters now converging on the ravine? Another call answered from a different direction, this one sharper and more aggressive, carrying an unmistakable edge of anger or challenge. The creature in the ravine with her began to pace, its movements no longer calm and controlled, but agitated, almost frantic. It glanced between Lyra and the ravine walls as if calculating options, weighing decisions. For the first time since the pursuit had begun, Lyra said she sensed genuine uncertainty in its behavior, as if events were unfolding in ways it had not anticipated or planned for. The creature suddenly moved toward her, and Lyra's hand went to the bear spray in a futile gesture of self-defense. But it did not attack. Instead, it grabbed her, not roughly, but with clear urgency, and lifted her toward a section of the ravine wall where the slope was less vertical, where handholds and footholds might allow someone to climb. It pushed her upward, its enormous hands positioning her feet on ledges and its vocalizations taking on a tone that sounded unmistakably like encouragement or instruction. It was trying to help her escape. The realization hit Lyra with stunning force. This creature had chased her for miles, had herded her into this ravine of corpses, had shown her evidence of decades of killing, and now it was trying to save her from whatever was approaching. The contradiction made no sense. Lyra scrambled upward, her injured wrist screaming with pain as she pulled herself from ledge to ledge. The creature below continued to vocalize, the sounds growing more desperate, more insistent. She was perhaps 15 feet up the ravine wall when the first of the newcomers appeared at the rim above her. The creature above was bigger, much bigger. Where her pursuer stood around 9 feet, this one loomed closer to 11, scarred and almost black, glaring down into the ravine before unleashing a roar that shook loose dirt. A second giant appeared beside it. Lyra froze, 3 of them now, and she was trapped. The smaller one, the one that had chased her, stood between her and the newcomers, vocalizing in sharp, nervous bursts. The 2 giants dropped into the ravine and confronted it, their gestures and harsh sounds aimed at her and the bodies scattered across the floor. Then one stopped, sniffed, and spotted her. Its roar hit her like a physical blow. It swatted the smaller creature aside, and the 2 giants began climbing toward her with slow, confident precision. The smaller creature slammed into them, breaking their climb and sending both crashing across the ravine. She bore witness to the 2 giants turning on the smaller one. Lyra climbed, using their fight as distraction. She was nearly at the rim when one howled. She said that she didn't know what happened, but the ravine shifted as a collapse began behind her. Lyra didn't look back. She dragged herself over the rim and ran. Lyra ran until she hit a near-vertical slope, and with no options left, threw herself down it. She tumbled violently, but survived, battered and half-broken at the bottom. For hours, Lyra limped aimlessly in the forest, without any sign of the creatures. She thought of the smaller creature that had chased her, protected her, and maybe even died for her. Whatever it had intended, it had made a choice no one would ever believe. Lyra left Bluff Creek and never returned. Some things she had learned were meant to stay hidden in the forest. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, rifle in hand, Corin paused beside a massive hemlock, his attention drawn to a series of broken branches, roughly 8 feet above the ground. The breaks were fresh, sap still glistening at the fracture points, and the pattern suggested something large had pushed through the area with considerable force. As he stood to continue tracking, a sound rolled through the forest that made him freeze. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, vibrating through his chest before rising into a guttural vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere. The call lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through the canopy. He adjusted the rifle slung across his shoulder and moved forward, following the line of prints as they led him deeper into the forest. The tracks were easy to follow at first, each footfall leaving a clear impression in the moss and soft earth. But after roughly 200 yards, the pattern changed. The prints became shallower, the stride length irregular, as if the creature had begun moving more carefully, aware that it was being followed. At 10:15, Corin reached a small clearing where the forest opened briefly before closing in again. He stopped at the edge, scanning the area with the methodical attention that had kept him alive in predator territory for over a decade. The clearing showed signs of recent disturbance. Ferns had been trampled in a rough circle approximately 30 feet in diameter, and several saplings had been bent nearly to the ground, their trunks showing stress fractures, but not completely broken. Then he saw the arrangement. In the center of the clearing, someone or something had stacked river stones in a cairn roughly 4 feet high. The stones were too large to have been carried by any animal smaller than a full-grown human, yet the nearest riverbed was over half a mile away through dense terrain. Around the cairn, arranged in a spiral pattern, were bones, deer ribs, what appeared to be elk vertebrae, and several smaller skeletal elements that Corin couldn't immediately identify. The arrangement was too precise to be random scavenger activity. Each bone had been placed at deliberate intervals, creating a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. Corin approached the cairn cautiously, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle. As he circled the structure, documenting it with his camera, he became aware of a sound that made his skin crawl. A rhythmic clicking echoed from the forest around him, coming from one direction. 3 quick clicks, pause, 2 clicks, pause, repeat. The pattern was too regular to be natural, too coordinated to be coincidental. He finished photographing the cairn and moved quickly toward the far side of the clearing where the tracks resumed. But as he reached the tree line, something massive moved in his peripheral vision. Corin spun, bringing his rifle up, and caught a glimpse of a dark shape disappearing behind a cluster of cedars roughly 60 yards to his left. The figure was upright, easily 8 feet tall, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. His heart hammered as he tracked the movement through his rifle scope, but the creature had vanished into the dense undergrowth. Only the swaying of branches marked its passage, and even that settled quickly, leaving no clear indication of which direction it had gone. The clicking sound intensified, now coming from ahead of him rather than behind, as if whatever was out there had circled around while he was focused on the cairn. Corin made a decision that would define the next several hours. Instead of retreating to reassess, he pushed forward, following the tracks as they led him along a ridgeline that overlooked a steep ravine. The terrain was becoming more challenging, the forest floor littered with fallen logs and dense undergrowth that made silent movement nearly impossible. Every step seemed to announce his presence, yet the clicking sounds maintained their distance, always just beyond visual range, but close enough to remind him that he was being monitored. At 11:40, the forest changed. The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Corin said he could hear his own heartbeat. He paused beside a massive cedar, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Then he heard it. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the forest, each impact sending vibrations through the ground beneath his feet. The sound was unmistakable. Something large was moving toward him, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. Corin estimated the source at roughly 100 yards ahead, moving along the same ridgeline he was following. The thuds came at regular intervals, suggesting bipedal locomotion, each footfall carrying the weight of something massive. He moved off the trail, positioning himself behind a fallen log that offered both cover and a clear line of sight down the ridge. Through his scope, he watched the tree line, waiting for whatever was approaching to reveal itself. The thuds grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the sound of branches snapping and undergrowth being pushed aside. Whatever was coming wasn't bothering with stealth anymore. At approximately 120 yards, Corin saw movement. A massive shape emerged from behind a cluster of hemlocks, moving with deliberate purpose along the ridge. Even at that distance, the creature's size was staggering. It stood fully upright, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the space between trees. Its body was covered in dark reddish-brown fur, thick and coarse, catching the filtered sunlight in a way that made it seem almost to glow. Corin watched through his scope as the creature approached a point roughly 80 yards from his position. He could see details now that the distance had hidden before. The face was distinctly primate, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that suggested incredible bite force. But the eyes were what held his attention. Even at this distance, he could see intelligence in that gaze. Not the simple awareness of an animal, but something deeper, more complex, suggesting cognitive capability far beyond instinct. The creature stopped suddenly, its head snapping toward Corin's position with startling precision. For several seconds, man and creature regarded each other across the distance. Corin's finger moved to his rifle's trigger, but something in the creature's posture suggested it posed no immediate threat. It simply stood there, watching him with the same attention he was giving it. Before Corin could react, the creature dropped to all fours and exploded into motion. Not toward him, but parallel to his position, moving along the ridge with shocking speed. Within seconds, it had covered over 50 yards, its massive form weaving between trees with an agility that seemed impossible for something so large. Corin tracked it through his scope, but the creature was already disappearing into the dense forest, leaving only swaying branches and disturbed undergrowth to mark its passage. He checked his GPS coordinates and marked his current position, then began moving along the ridge, following the direction the creature had taken. But with each step, the sense of being watched intensified. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision, always just beyond clear sight. Branches would snap in the distance, then fall silent when he turned to investigate. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Corin discovered something that confirmed his growing suspicion. He had been following what appeared to be a game trail when he noticed that several large logs had been positioned across the path at strategic intervals. The logs were too large to have fallen naturally into such precise placement, and their arrangement created a series of obstacles that funneled movement in a specific direction. He said that he photographed the log placement and continued forward, but now he moved with increased caution. The trail was leading him exactly where something wanted him to go, and every instinct told him that following it further would be a mistake. Yet turning back meant abandoning the pursuit, and after coming this far, he said that the option felt impossible. At 2:15, Corin reached a point where the trail split. One path continued down toward the ravine, while the other curved back up toward higher ground. He paused, studying both options, when a rock tumbled down the slope to his left. He spun toward the sound, rifle ready, and caught a glimpse of movement roughly 40 yards upslope, the same massive shape, moving through the trees with the same fluid grace. The creature paused, partially visible behind a Douglas fir, and Corin realized it was deliberately showing itself. The message was clear. "I know where you are. I control this terrain, and I am guiding your movements." The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was the prey. Corin chose the upward path, refusing to be funneled toward the ravine. His decision was met with immediate response. The clicking sounds intensified, becoming more rapid and agitated, and within seconds he heard movement on both sides of the trail. Whatever was out there didn't want him going that direction, and it was making its displeasure known through coordinated vocalizations that echoed through the forest like a warning system. He pushed forward anyway, climbing over fallen logs and through dense undergrowth that seemed to grow thicker with every step. The terrain fought him, branches whipping across his face, roots catching his boots, the slope steepening until he was using his hands as much as his feet to maintain progress. And through it all, he could hear it moving parallel to his position, keeping pace effortlessly while he struggled through obstacles that seemed almost deliberately placed. At 3 o'clock, Corin reached a small plateau and stopped to catch his breath. His GPS showed he had covered less than half a mile in the past 45 minutes, the difficult terrain slowing his progress to a crawl. He checked his equipment, ensuring his rifle was clear of debris and his ammunition remained dry. He pulled out his thermal optics and scanned the surrounding forest. The device was military-grade, capable of detecting heat signatures at distances up to 300 yards. What he saw made his breath catch. A large heat signature near his position, positioned at roughly 30 yards from him. It wasn't moving, just maintaining its position, as if waiting for him to make his next move. Corin made a decision that would escalate the encounter beyond simple observation. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the report echoing through the forest like thunder. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The heat signature on his thermal display exploded into motion, not fleeing, but advancing, closing the perimeter with precision. The clicking sounds transformed into deeper vocalizations, low, resonant calls that seemed to vibrate through his chest. He shouldered his pack and moved quickly along the plateau, heading toward what appeared to be a gap in the advancing perimeter. But as he ran, he realized the gap was deliberate. It was giving him an escape route, steering him once again toward the ravine he had tried to avoid. Every other direction was blocked by obstacles, leaving him only one option if he wanted to avoid direct confrontation. The forest opened ahead, and Corin found himself at the edge of a steep slope that descended into a narrow valley. He started down, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. He used saplings and exposed roots to control his descent, but the slope was steeper than it had appeared from above, and within minutes he was sliding more than climbing, fighting to maintain any semblance of control. Halfway down, Corin heard a sound that made him freeze despite the precarious footing. A massive shape appeared at the top of the slope, silhouetted against the sky. The creature stood fully upright, watching his descent with obvious interest. Then, in a display that demonstrated both intelligence and physical capability far beyond any known animal, it dropped to all fours and began descending the slope parallel to his position, moving with shocking speed and control across terrain that had him barely maintaining balance. Corin tried to increase his pace, but the slope was too unstable. His right foot hit a patch of loose shale, and he went down hard, sliding 20 feet before catching himself on an exposed root. Pain shot through his shoulder where he had impacted a rock, but he forced himself upright and continued downward. The creature maintained its parallel descent, never closing the distance, but never falling behind, demonstrating complete mastery of terrain that was defeating him. At the bottom of the slope, Corin stumbled into the fog-shrouded valley floor. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and visibility was reduced to perhaps 30 feet in any direction. He could hear water running somewhere nearby, suggesting a creek or stream, but the fog distorted sound in ways that made direction difficult to determine. He pulled out his thermal optics again and immediately wished he hadn't. The display showed a heat signature positioned at roughly 40 to 50 yards. It had descended while he was fighting the slope, and now it had him effectively trapped in the valley bottom. But it wasn't advancing, just maintaining its position, as if waiting for something. The realization crept over him slowly. It was studying him, observing his behavior, treating him the way a researcher might observe a specimen in controlled conditions. Corin decided to try communication. He had read reports of researchers attempting vocal interaction with unknown primates, using a combination of wood knocks and vocalizations to establish non-threatening intent. He found a fallen branch and struck it against a tree trunk 3 times, then waited. The response came within seconds, 3 knocks from the fog ahead of him, perfectly mimicking his pattern. He tried a different sequence. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The response matched exactly, coming from a different direction this time. He attempted vocalization next, producing a low, sustained call that he hoped would be interpreted as non-aggressive. The forest fell silent for several seconds, then erupted with a response. Vocalization came from one direction, distinct in tone and pitch. The call was complex, carrying inflections and patterns that seemed almost linguistic. It was possibly talking to him in a language he couldn't begin to understand. Movement in the fog caught his attention. A massive shape emerged from the mist roughly 20 yards ahead, moving with deliberate slowness. Corin raised his rifle but didn't aim, keeping the barrel pointed at the ground in what he hoped was a non-threatening posture. The creature stopped at the edge of clear visibility, partially obscured by fog, but close enough that he could see details that the distance had previously hidden. The face was remarkably expressive, with eyes that tracked his every movement with obvious intelligence. The creature's posture suggested caution rather than aggression. Shoulders slightly hunched, arms held loosely at its sides, head tilted in what appeared to be curiosity. For several seconds, they regarded each other through the fog, neither moving, both assessing the situation. Then the creature did something that shattered any remaining doubt about its cognitive capability. It raised one massive hand and gestured toward Corin's rifle, then shook its head slowly from side to side. The message was unmistakable. The weapon was unnecessary. Corin found himself lowering the rifle despite every survival instinct, screaming at him to maintain a defensive posture. The creature nodded once, a gesture of approval or perhaps acknowledgement, then stepped back into the fog and disappeared. Corin checked his GPS and realized he had been pushed nearly 2 miles from his original tracking location. The creature had effectively herded him through the forest, controlling his movement with a combination of intimidation, terrain manipulation, and coordinated positioning. Every choice he thought he had made independently had actually been guided, funneled toward outcomes it had predetermined. The hunt he thought he was conducting had been an illusion from the start. He decided to attempt establishing a more permanent observation position. Using his remaining daylight, he set up a basic camp in a small clearing near the creek. He positioned motion-activated cameras at strategic points around the perimeter, each one equipped with infrared capability for night observation. He scattered bait, dried venison, and fish at intervals designed to attract investigation. And he prepared several simple snares using paracord and spring-loaded mechanisms, not with any real expectation of capturing something so large, but to test whether it would recognize and avoid obvious traps. As darkness fell, the heat signature that had been haunting him earlier had withdrawn to a greater distance, but it remained present, positioned in a loose perimeter roughly 100 yards out. It was giving him space, but it hadn't left. At 8:30 that evening, his first motion camera triggered. Corin checked the feed on his portable monitor and saw a massive shape approaching one of his bait stations. The creature moved with obvious caution, pausing frequently to scan the area before advancing. When it reached the bait, it didn't simply grab the food and retreat. Instead, it examined the entire setup, looking at the camera from multiple angles, studying the way the bait had been positioned, even checking the surrounding area for additional equipment. Then, the creature picked up the camera, turned it to face directly at Corin's position, and set it back down. Over the next 3 hours, similar scenes played out at each of his camera positions. The creature approached his bait stations, examined his equipment, and in several cases deliberately disabled his cameras by covering the lenses with mud and vegetation. It avoided his snares with casual ease, in some cases stepping over the trigger mechanisms with precision that suggested it understood exactly how the traps functioned. The creature even dismantled a snare completely, laying out the components in a neat line as if providing a lesson in trap construction. By midnight, Corin's carefully planned observation network had been systematically neutralized. His cameras were disabled or repositioned, his bait was gone, and his traps had been rendered useless. And through it all, the creature had maintained its perimeter, never approaching his actual camp, but making it abundantly clear that it controlled the situation completely. He tried using thermal calls next, playing recorded vocalizations through a portable speaker. The creature responded immediately, but not in the way he expected. Instead of answering his recorded calls, it began producing vocalizations that perfectly mimicked his own voice. Words and phrases he had spoken earlier in the day played back with startling accuracy. The psychological impact was profound. Corin realized he wasn't just being observed, he was being studied with the same methodical attention he had intended to apply. Every action he took was being analyzed, cataloged, and apparently understood at a level that suggested a cognitive capability approaching or possibly exceeding human intelligence. He managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful rest before dawn began filtering through the fog. When he emerged from his tent, he found his camp had been visited during the night. In the center, someone or something had constructed a small cairn identical to the one he had found the previous day. Arranged around it in a spiral pattern were bones, not animal bones this time, but his own equipment. Batteries from his cameras, memory cards from his recording devices, even the firing pin from one of his backup rifles, somehow removed with surgical precision while he slept. Corin stood in the center of his violated camp, the implications settling over him like the morning fog. Everything he had brought to document and potentially capture this creature had been systematically identified, examined, and neutralized. He made a decision that would define the remainder of his time in the forest. If observation and documentation had failed, he would attempt a terminal solution. His remaining equipment included a high-powered .308 rifle loaded with soft-point rounds designed for maximum trauma and controlled expansion, several lengths of high-tensile rope, and a field dressing kit. The plan was desperate and probably foolish, but the alternative was leaving empty-handed after being systematically outmaneuvered by something that wasn't supposed to exist. Corin spent the morning preparing. He identified a narrow section of the ravine where the terrain would funnel movement, creating a natural choke point. He positioned his rifle with clear sight lines and prepared a drag path. The setup was professional, based on techniques he had used successfully on elk and bear. But even as he worked, He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By noon, his ambush was ready. He positioned himself in a concealed blind roughly 40 yards from the choke point, his rifle loaded and ready. Then he did something calculated to draw attention. He activated an electronic caller that produced distress vocalizations of a deer fawn, a sound that typically attracted predators from considerable distances. Then he saw movement. A massive shape emerged from the tree line roughly 100 yards from his position, moving with obvious caution toward the electronic caller. It was enormous, perhaps 8.5 feet tall, its dark fur matted with dew and forest duff. Corin's breath hitched. This was the one. The intelligence in its movements was palpable, a calculated survey of the space. It paused, head tilting, and for a moment its eyes seemed to lock directly onto his blind. Corin raised the rifle, his crosshairs settling not on the center mass, but on the thick muscle of the creature's upper leg. He needed it immobilized, not destroyed. The report of the rifle cracked through the ravine. The creature roared, a sound of profound shock and betrayal that seemed to shake the fog from the branches. As it stumbled, a dark spray erupting from its thigh. It didn't flee blindly, but turned with a staggering lurch, one massive hand clamping over the wound as it began dragging itself toward the dense timber with terrifying, purposeful speed, leaving a wide, glistening trail in the pine needles. Corin waited a full 10 minutes, letting the shock and blood loss do their work. When he moved from the blind, the sign was unmistakable. Great splashes of crimson on the fern heads, smears on the bark of passing trees where the creature had braced itself. The trail led not in a panicked line, but in a deliberate, agonizing zigzag, utilizing deadfall and thickets for cover. It was still thinking, still trying to lose him. For 2 hours he tracked it, a grim procession through the silent woods. The blood pattern changed, from bright arterial spurts to a steady, ominous drip as the creature's heart laboriously compensated. He found where it had paused to pack moss against the wound, a crude but effective field dressing. He found where it had doubled back 50 yards to traverse a rocky creek bed, forcing Corin to spend precious minutes finding where it exited on the far side, a single bloody print on a dry stone. The chase became a perverse dialogue, the creature employing every evasive tactic Corin had ever read about in hunting manuals, Corin doggedly reading the story written in the soil. The trail finally led deeper into a dank hollow strewn with the skeletal remains of a long-ago avalanche, a tomb of deadfall and rotting cedar. The air grew cold and still. The blood was everywhere now, soaked into the ground, painting the roots. He found it there, propped against the base of a rotten cedar as if it had chosen its final resting place. Its chest heaved in slow, ragged bellows. The intelligence was still there in its eyes, watching him approach with a weary, ancient comprehension that made his skin crawl. It made no attempt to rise, no final defensive gesture. It simply watched, its gaze holding a terrible, exhausted knowledge. It made no sound as he raised the rifle a second time, settling the sights between its eyes, and ended it. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before. Corin worked quickly in that profound quiet, the adrenaline sharp and metallic in his throat. Using his hunting saw and skinning knife, he separated the massive head from the torso. The work was gruesome, mechanical. The weight was tremendous, the fur coarse and thick under his blood-slicked hands. The neck musculature was like cable, the vertebrae dense. He wrapped the trophy in a green tarp, which immediately began to bloom with dark, wet stains, and secured the bundle with rope before beginning the long, grueling drag back toward his camp. That night, in the cone of his headlamp, he examined his prize. The features were a brutal paradox, a pronounced sagittal crest, suggestive of primal power, but a brow and jawline that held a disquieting, almost human proportion. The eyes, half-lidded, seemed to hold a final, frozen judgment. He had won. He had proof. But as he sat in the firelight, the massive skull cleaned and packed beside him, a cold understanding seeped in. the cairn of bones, the mimicked voice, the surgical disarmament of his camp. These were not the acts of a mere animal. They were the acts of a person. The deliberate zigzag of the blood trail, the use of the stream, the moss packed in the wound. These were the strategies of a mind, not an instinct. And he had not outmaneuvered it. It had simply run out of time, its body failing its brilliant, desperate mind. He had come to study a legend and had instead committed a murder. The trophy beside him was no longer just evidence. It was an artifact of a crime, and its weight felt less like a victory and more like a sentence handed down by the silent, watching trees. He had caught his monster, and in doing so had unmasked his own. Alexandra Tanari's first recovered footage in the Bitterroot Range began abruptly at 3:12 p.m. on June 21st, suggesting that earlier recordings had been lost or deliberately erased. Alexandra appeared on camera walking through towering cedar and fir trees. Her voice, initially calm and professional, described following what she termed an unusual animal vocalization that had drawn her away from her established campsite. Alexandra had been hearing the eerie sound for about an hour as she navigated through undergrowth thick enough to require constant attention to her footing. The noise was unlike anything in her field guides. It was too structured for a typical animal call, and clearly not human. What kind of creature could produce something so deliberate, yet remain unseen? The forest around her showed signs of unusual disturbance. Branches had been broken at heights, suggesting something much taller than a human had passed through moss on tree trunks, bore scrape marks in patterns that did not match any known wildlife behavior. Most significantly, she mentions in the footage that a trail camera that Alexandra had positioned earlier that morning was missing entirely. The tree where she had secured the camera told its own story. In the footage, 3 deep vertical scratches scored the bark, each approximately 6 inches long and penetrating nearly an inch into the wood. The spacing between the marks suggested they had been made simultaneously by something with claws or fingers capable of gripping the entire circumference of the trunk. Alexandra's camera work remained steady as she documented these findings. She approached the damaged tree cautiously, using a measuring tape to record the dimensions of the scratches. The precision of her documentation suggested someone accustomed to scientific methodology, making her subsequent observations all the more credible. Could her calm professionalism withstand what was coming next? As she worked, a sound echoed across the valley, a sharp, resonant knock that seemed to come from the opposite ridge. Alexandra froze, her camera automatically focusing on the distant tree line. The sound repeated 3 short knocks followed by 1 longer one, the rhythm too precise to be the result of falling timber or natural settling. Alexandra realized immediately that it was not an echo, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement rather than fear. She had encountered something that challenged her understanding of forest acoustics, but her scientific curiosity remained stronger than any sense of danger. Alexandra picked up a fallen branch and struck it against a nearby tree, mimicking the rhythm she had heard. The response came immediately. The same pattern, but noticeably closer, and with a slightly different tonal quality that suggested a different striking surface. If it wasn't an echo, then how close had it already come? This means that something in the forest was not only capable of producing structured acoustic signals, but was actively engaging in what could only be described as communication. The response time eliminated the possibility of an echo, and the variation in tone suggested intentional modification rather than simple mimicry. Alexandra attempted the exchange twice more, each time receiving an immediate response that grew progressively closer. Her excitement was audible as she realized that whatever was out there was definitely trying to communicate, and that the pattern recognition was far too sophisticated to be coincidence. Specialists noted that the responding knocks showed characteristics that ruled out human origin. The resonance suggested striking surfaces much larger than anything a person could reasonably carry, and the volume indicated striking force beyond normal human capability. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Footage showed Alexandra making the decision to establish a temporary observation post rather than return to her main campsite. She selected a position with good visibility across the valley, set up her equipment, and prepared to document whatever might emerge as darkness approached. By the time night fully enveloped the forest, Alexandra's audio equipment picked up the familiar nocturnal sounds, but also something else. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse just below the threshold of conscious hearing. Alexandra whispered to her camera as she adjusted the audio levels to better capture the phenomenon, noting that the sound resembled a heartbeat but was unnaturally slow and impossibly deep. The sound was indeed rhythmic, occurring approximately every 3 seconds with a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. Audio analysis would later reveal frequencies in the subsonic range, below normal human hearing but capable of being felt as vibrations through the ground and in the chest cavity. Alexandra's campfire provided a small circle of light in the overwhelming darkness, but beyond its reach, the forest had become an alien landscape. Her thermal imaging equipment, designed for wildlife photography, began picking up heat signatures that defied easy explanation. Large, warm masses moved through the trees at distances that made identification impossible, but their size and movement patterns ruled out known wildlife. How many of them were out there watching her? At 11:47 p.m., according to the camera's timestamp, something changed. The normal forest sounds ceased abruptly, as if every creature within miles had simultaneously decided to fall silent. The absence of sound was so complete that Alexandra's own breathing seemed unnaturally loud inside her tent. In the footage, Alexandra's voice grew tight, likely with anxiety, as she realized something was wrong. The forest had gone unnaturally silent, and everything around her had stopped. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes, an eternity in a forest that should have been alive with nocturnal activity. Then, gradually, a new sound emerged, the soft whisper of fabric under tension as something brushed against her tent. Alexandra's hand was visibly trembling as she reached for the tent's zipper, her camera focused on the entrance. The brushing sound continued, as if something was examining the structure with careful attention. Was it testing the boundary or testing her reaction? When she finally opened the flap, her light revealed nothing but empty forest, but the ground around her tent told a different story. Footprints surrounded her campsite in a rough circle, each impression clearly visible in the soft earth. The prints were enormous, approximately 16 inches long and proportionally wide, with clear toe marks at the front. The depth of the impressions suggested a creature weighing several hundred pounds, but the stride length indicated bipedal locomotion with a gait far longer than any human could achieve. Alexandra's scientific training overcame her fear as she documented the prints with meticulous care. She used her boot for scale reference, photographed each clear impression from multiple angles, and measured the stride length between consecutive prints. The evidence was undeniable. Something massive and bipedal had circled her campsite while she slept. As she worked, small rocks began landing near her tent. The first few were pebble-sized, barely audible as they struck the ground. But they grew progressively larger, and their placement became more deliberate. Each rock landed closer to her position, as if whatever was throwing them was testing her reaction or trying to provoke a response. The final rock was the size of a softball, landing with enough force to send up a spray of dirt just feet from where Alexandra knelt. The message was unmistakable. She was being warned, tested, or perhaps invited to respond. But respond to what, and by whom, or what? The last sound captured before Alexandra cut the recording was a deep, resonant exhalation that seemed to come from lungs far larger than any human possessed. It wasn't the sharp snort of a startled animal or the huffing of an agitated bear. This was a sigh, deliberate, almost contemplative, carrying an undertone of intelligence that likely froze her in place. In the hours that followed, the recovered footage filled in a grim chronology of disorientation and fear. Alexandra's voice, once analytical and composed, grew increasingly fragmented as she wandered through terrain that seemed subtly altered each time she retraced her steps. Dawn arrived without relief. For 3 hours, her recordings showed her sitting motionless near a stream, trembling, mumbling that the forest was breathing. At 10:17 a.m. on June 22nd, it revealed a dramatically changed Alexandra Tenari, her face drawn, her voice flat, and the analytical clarity that once defined her completely replaced by quiet, hollow dread. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera, and her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been present in earlier recordings. Most telling was her posture, constantly scanning the tree line, shoulders hunched as if expecting an attack from any direction. Alexandra admitted to the camera that she didn't think she had slept more than 20 minutes at a time. Every time she started to drift off, she heard movement just outside the light. Footsteps circling the camp, but always staying just beyond where she could see. Was it still out there, waiting for her to close her eyes again? Her campsite told the story of a sleepless night spent in defensive preparation. The fire had been built up far beyond what was necessary for warmth, with a stockpile of wood that would have taken hours to gather in darkness. Her equipment was arranged in a tight perimeter around her sleeping area, creating multiple barriers between herself and the surrounding forest. But it was the condition of her food cache that provided the most disturbing evidence of overnight visitation. The bear-proof container, designed to withstand the efforts of a 600-pound grizzly, had been opened with a disturbing mix of force and care. The external locking components were battered and torn, yet the chest itself and its latch remained unbroken and largely undisturbed. What kind of creature could open what even a bear couldn't? The contents had been examined rather than consumed. In the footage, the packages shown were opened and their contents were missing bits of it, suggesting something tasted them. Nothing else was missing, but everything had been handled. Most unsettling was what had been added: a large fish head, still fresh, placed deliberately on top of the cooler. Alexandra said in the footage that this wasn't random animal behavior, her voice filled with obvious distress. The placement of the fish head struck her as deliberate, as if it were a gift, or perhaps a challenge. Alexandra made the decision to abandon her planned research and hike out immediately. She packed with efficient haste, but her movements were constantly interrupted by pauses to listen and scan the forest around her. Something had fundamentally altered her relationship with the wilderness. She was no longer an observer, but prey being stalked by an intelligence she couldn't comprehend. The hike began normally enough, following established game trails through terrain that should have been familiar from her approach route. But within an hour, Alexandra encountered the first sign that her departure wouldn't be straightforward. Her compass, a precision instrument she had relied on for years of backcountry navigation, was behaving erratically. What could twist a magnetic field this far from any man-made interference? Alexandra said that the needle kept spinning, tapping the compass face with growing frustration. It would point north for a few seconds, then swing completely around, behavior she had never seen before. Either Alexandra was experiencing equipment failure at the worst possible time, or something in the environment was disrupting navigation instruments. As she struggled with navigation, Alexandra began encountering increasingly obvious signs of manipulation in the forest around her. Young trees had been bent and twisted into crude X-shapes. She observed that these were markers, documenting each formation with her camera. She noted that someone or something was marking territory, or perhaps creating a trail system. The strength required to bend the trees was immense, far beyond what any human could accomplish without tools. The bent trees led her deeper into unfamiliar terrain, away from the established trails she had planned to follow. Alexandra recognized the manipulation, but felt compelled to follow, likely driven by a combination of scientific curiosity or maybe a growing certainty that deviation from this path might provoke a more direct confrontation. Was she documenting evidence or walking into a trap? At one of the larger tree formations, Alexandra made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. Caught in the bark where the trunk had been bent was a tuft of hair, long, coarse strands in a reddish-brown color that didn't match any known wildlife in the region. She collected samples with tweezers, sealing them in specimen containers with the methodical care of someone accustomed to evidence collection. She reported that the hair was unlike anything she had seen, examining the strands under a magnifying glass. The texture was too coarse for human hair, and the length and color did not match any regional mammals. As Alexandra documented the hair samples, her camera's autofocus suddenly shifted to the background, revealing a large shadow moving behind the bent tree. The shape was indistinct, but clearly bipedal, moving with a fluid gait that suggested both power and stealth. When Alexandra tried to look directly at the location, nothing was visible, but the audio track captured a sound that made her blood freeze. A deep, huffing exhalation like a bull preparing to charge. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Alexandra stumbled backward, dropping her camera as panic overrode her scientific detachment. The device continued recording the heavy footstep that shook the ground near the microphone. Was it moving toward her, or circling again? When she retrieved the camera, her hands were shaking so violently that the footage became nearly unwatchable. But the audio remained clear, picking up a sound that would haunt investigators for months afterward, a low, grumbling vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The sound had structure, rhythm, and variation that suggested language rather than simple animal communication. Alexandra whispered that it was talking, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and wonder. She said that whatever was out there was attempting to communicate, but not with her directly. The sounds were directed at others she could not see. If Alexandra's assessment was correct, she wasn't being stalked by a single creature, but by a group capable of coordinated behavior and complex communication. The isolation she had sought for her research had become a trap, with her as the subject of study rather than the observer. How long had she been surrounded without realizing it? The footage shows Alexandra in a state of near panic, her breathing ragged as she described being lost. She reported that she had passed the same clearing 3 times for hours, her voice tight with frustration and growing fear. Although her GPS indicated she was moving, she kept ending up in the same locations, as if the trails were shifting when she wasn't looking. On a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, Alexandra discovered evidence that her confusion wasn't accidental. She observed that someone had been following her trail, documenting the modified marker with close-up footage. One of her own trail markers, a bright orange ribbon she had tied to mark her route. However, the ribbon was shredded into strips and retied into complex knots. Who had the patience and the intent to do this without being seen? At this point, the psychological pressure was likely becoming unbearable. Alexandra's scientific objectivity crumbled as she realized she was no longer documenting wildlife behavior, but had become part of an elaborate game whose rules she didn't understand. What did they want from her? Fear, or something worse? Then, from somewhere in the forest, a human voice called her name, Alexandra, with perfect pronunciation and inflection. The voice was male, middle-aged, and carried the casual tone of someone trying to get a friend's attention. Alexandra's response was immediate and instinctive. She called out, her voice cracking with desperate hope, demanding to know if someone was there and begging for help. The response came from a completely different direction, her own voice repeating the words with exactly the same inflection, tone, and emotional content, down to the crack in her voice and the desperate undertone. Alexandra could hardly believe what she was hearing, her camera shaking as she spun to locate the source of the sound. How could something mirror her so perfectly, down to the tremor in her breath? Alexandra's nerve finally broke completely. She fled the clearing in blind panic, crashing through undergrowth with no regard for direction or safety. Her camera bounced wildly, creating a chaotic record of her flight through dense forest. But even in her panic, the audio equipment continued to function, capturing sounds that would later prove crucial to understanding what was pursuing her. Behind her, barely audible above her own crashing progress, came the sound of something large moving through the forest with surprising stealth. The pursuit wasn't rushed or aggressive. It maintained a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Was it toying with her, testing her limits before closing in? At the edge of another clearing, Alexandra stumbled and fell, her camera flying from her hands to land lens up in the soft earth. As she scrambled to retrieve it, the device captured a clear handprint in the mud just feet from where she had fallen. The print was enormous, showing 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, in proportions that were recognizably humanoid but far larger than any human hand. Most remarkably, the print showed clear dermal ridges, fingerprints that proved this wasn't a paw or hoof, but an actual hand belonging to something with primate characteristics. Then, from the darkness beyond her camera's light, came a sound, a series of vocalizations that combined elements of human speech with tones and frequencies no human throat could produce. The sounds had rhythm, structure, and variation that clearly indicated language, but a language unlike anything in human experience. A chilling realization washed over Alexandra as she understood that they were talking about her. Over the next several hours, the footage captured her increasingly frantic attempts to navigate back toward the logging road. Her breathing grew ragged, her pace slower, her flashlight beam jerking erratically across trees. At 9:17 p.m., she stumbled upon the same clearing for the 3rd time, muttering that the trails were shifting. When the timestamp reached 11:43 p.m., the camera showed Alexandra wedged inside the hollow trunk of a massive cedar tree. The psychological torture was unbearable. Rather than attacking directly, her pursuers maintained a presence just beyond perception, close enough to be sensed but never clearly seen, creating a state of constant hypervigilance that was rapidly exhausting Alexandra's mental and physical reserves. Then, the audio track captured the rhythmic crack of branches under enormous weight. Something massive was pacing around her hiding place with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to go. Was it waiting for her to move or for her to break? Her voice, tight with controlled panic, stated that the footsteps were too heavy and too slow. Whatever was making them must have weighed at least 500 pounds, yet it moved as if it had all the time in the world, like it knew she couldn't escape. At 12:17 a.m., the nature of the encounter changed dramatically. The steady footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made Alexandra jolt, a deep resonant thump that seemed to come from directly above her hiding place. Something had climbed the cedar tree and was now positioned in the canopy overhead. Alexandra whispered in horror as her camera tilted upward, capturing the massive branches swaying under an enormous weight. The implications were terrifying. Bears could climb, but never with the stealth and precision being demonstrated. The creature had repositioned itself with absolute silence until the moment it chose to reveal its presence. If it chose when to be heard, what else could it choose to control? The terror continued with a series of soft thumps as objects began falling around Alexandra's hiding place. At first, she thought they were pine cones or small branches dislodged by the creature's movement, but as her camera's light revealed the objects, a more sinister pattern emerged. Rocks were being dropped with deliberate precision, each one landing closer to the hollow trunk where Alexandra cowered. The placement wasn't random. It formed a tightening spiral. Alexandra realized, her voice cracking with the strain of prolonged terror, that this was not normal hunting behavior. She was completely at the mercy of something that could have harmed her at any time, but chose instead to demonstrate its control over the situation. Was this communication or a warning of what was coming next? Then came the sound that shattered Alexandra's remaining composure. A huge thump exploded from the darkness, followed by footsteps with terrifying suddenness. Her camera swung wildly as she screamed, capturing fragmentary images of something massive rushing past the opening of her hiding place. The creature moved with impossible speed for something so large, its passage marked by the crash of breaking branches and a roar that seemed to combine elements of bear, big cat, and something entirely alien. The charge stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving Alexandra sobbing and hyperventilating in her hollow tree. But the audio equipment continued recording, capturing what happened next. From the darkness came a series of vocalizations unlike anything in the scientific literature. The sounds combined deep, guttural tones with rapid-fire clicks and what could only be described as structured syllables. Similar to before, they're talking to each other again. Alexandra's nerve finally broke completely. Despite every survival instinct telling her to remain hidden, the psychological pressure likely became unbearable. She burst from her hiding place and fled into the open forest, her camera bouncing wildly as she crashed through undergrowth in blind panic. The pursuit that followed was captured in chaotic fragments, glimpses of massive shapes moving through the trees. But what made the footage truly terrifying was the realization that her pursuers weren't trying to catch her. They were herding her toward a specific destination. Why would predators herd instead of hunt, unless they wanted her alive? Every time Alexandra tried to change direction, sounds would emerge from the forest to guide her back onto a predetermined path. Branches would crash to her left, forcing her right vocalizations would echo from behind, driving her forward. She was being manipulated with the skill of experienced hunters who understood both the terrain and their prey's psychology. The herding continued for over an hour, leading Alexandra deeper into terrain she didn't recognize. Her camera captured glimpses of increasingly alien landscape, rock formations that seemed almost architectural, trees arranged in patterns too regular to be natural, and clearings that showed signs of long-term habitation by something with intelligence and purpose. At 2:33 a.m., Alexandra stumbled into a ravine. Her camera's light revealed a horrific scene. The ravine floor was littered with bones, not the random scatter of natural predation, but organized collections that suggested systematic hunting and consumption over an extended period. Alexandra whispered a trembling curse as her camera panned slowly across the bone field. The bones represented multiple species: deer, elk, smaller mammals, and scattered among them, fragments that were unmistakably human. A hiking boot, partially buried in the ravine floor, still contained the skeletal remains of a foot. Rib bones showed cut marks that suggested systematic butchering rather than random scavenging. But it was the organization of the bone field that provided the most disturbing evidence of intelligence. The remains were sorted by type and size, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. Rather than simple disposal, skulls were positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter, their empty sockets seeming to watch over the macabre collection. They're keeping trophies. At the center of the bone field, the footage showed something peculiar: a nest constructed from moss, fur, and carefully woven branches. The structure was enormous, easily large enough to accommodate something 8 feet tall, and showed signs of regular use. Fresh bedding materials suggested recent occupation. As Alexandra documented the nest, her camera captured movement in her peripheral vision. Something was watching her from the shadows at the ravine's edge, a massive silhouette that remained perfectly still until she turned to look directly at it. The creature's eyes reflected her camera's light, and for several seconds, predator and prey regarded each other across the bone field. Was it studying her or deciding what to do next? The creature's size was overwhelming even at a distance. Standing fully upright, it towered at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to suggest incredible physical power. Then the creature did something that shattered Alexandra's remaining skepticism about its intelligence. It raised one massive arm and pointed deliberately at something behind her. Alexandra spun to find herself surrounded. 3 more creatures had emerged from concealment around the ravine's perimeter, each one massive and clearly coordinating with the others. She was trapped in the center of their killing ground, with no possibility of escape. The footage that followed captured the final minutes of Alexandra Tanari's freedom. The creatures approached slowly, their movements careful and controlled, despite their obvious physical superiority. They showed no aggression, no predatory excitement, only the calm efficiency of beings who had done this many times before. Alexandra's camera shook violently as she backed toward the center of the ravine, her breathing rapid and shallow. She pleaded softly, her words trembling with exhaustion and fear, saying that she only wanted to go home. The largest creature, the one that had first pointed, approached within arm's reach and made a series of soft vocalizations, almost gentle sounds that seemed intended to calm rather than threaten. Its massive hand reached out slowly. Alexandra seemingly dropped her camera as she was lifted from the ground with surprising gentleness. The device continued recording from the ravine floor, capturing the sound of her voice growing distant as she was carried away. The camera continued recording for another 6 hours, capturing only the empty bone field and the gradual return of normal forest sounds. When the battery finally died, it marked the end of the most comprehensive documentation of unknown intelligence ever recovered from the North American wilderness. On June 15, 2015, a mother from Oklahoma called 911, her house torn apart. Doors splintered, massive handprints gouged into the siding, and her daughter attacked. What followed would be one of the most disputed Bigfoot-related disappearances ever on reservation land. Anita Graywolf, 39, was a social worker from Tulsa who had spent most of her life listening to other people's stories and learning how to separate fear from fact. After years in the city, she decided to return with her daughter, Maya, to the family property on the southeastern border of the Cherokee Reservation, a place her grandparents had once warned her never to disturb. For Anita, the move felt like both an escape and a responsibility, to remind her daughter where she came from, unaware that the valley they were returning to had been waiting for them. The land sat beside Hollow Valley, a stretch of forest that Anita remembered only through half-forgotten warnings from her grandparents. The stories she said she knew had always been about the Stone Man, a guardian spirit said to rise when people disturbed the balance of the old ground. Anita had once laughed at those tales. Now, standing in the quiet clearing, she found herself uneasy at how easily the valley swallowed sound. She said that when she announced her plans to stay for the summer, the tribal elders' concern unsettled her more than she admitted. They told her the Stone Man walks when people forget him, and that Hollow Valley remembers what was taken from it. She wanted to believe their tone was ceremonial, but there was something in their eyes that lingered after the conversation ended. She later learned their worry had roots in the past. In the 1950s, a limestone quarry had been cut directly into ground, once used for Cherokee burials and ceremonies. The elders said the land had never settled after that. But was it merely a story meant to preserve respect, or a warning too old to be ignored? Her skepticism would have felt firmer if she had known nothing of the missing person cases that surrounded the valley. For decades, rumors had circulated about disappearances quietly erased from tribal police files. The idea sounded impossible, but something about that absence, what wasn't on paper, bothered her. Why were those records erased, and by whom? By the time she and Maya arrived in early June 2015, Anita said that she was determined to treat the trip as a family experiment rather than a spiritual one. She had no reason to think the valley would challenge her sense of what was real. Maya, eager for a project, began recording interviews with elders for what she called a folklore study. Anita mentioned to investigators that she encouraged it, proud of her daughter's initiative. The drawings Maya made afterward, tall figures covered in moss with eyes like polished stone, struck Anita as creative exaggerations. So why did Maya's drawings start to match what others had described decades earlier? When Maya reviewed her recordings, she mentioned a faint pulsing sound that repeated through every clip filmed near the tree line. Anita assumed it was interference, maybe a faulty microphone. Later analysis by others would suggest the frequencies resembled those produced by large mammals, but at the time, Anita dismissed it without hesitation. The first thing she couldn't dismiss came from the dogs. They refused to cross the clearing that bordered the forest, bracing their legs and whining whenever she tried to lead them forward. Even food couldn't persuade them. Their bodies went rigid, muscles trembling, eyes fixed on the dark edge of the trees, as though something waited just beyond sight. Anita compared this animal reaction to what she had seen in trauma survivors: instinctive, unreasoned, absolute. She wrote it off at first as a remnant of travel stress, but over the next 2 days the dogs grew worse, pacing the porch at night and refusing to leave the steps, even to relieve themselves. On June 8th, she and Maya began hearing slow, deliberate impacts from the direction of the valley. 3 strikes, always in sequence, then silence. The sound was heavy, like wood on wet earth, each blow separated by an unnatural stillness. Anita kept count in a small notebook, treating each sound like a case note, noting the intervals and time of day. Sometimes the noises came after dusk, other times at dawn when the air was completely still. She wondered if stress or isolation had made her hypersensitive to noise, but the dogs would react first, heads lifting moments before she heard it. 4 days later, Maya filmed a short interview with her on the porch, a casual talk about family heritage and why they'd returned. The atmosphere felt peaceful, though Anita noticed the quiet had changed in a subtle way: the absence of birds, the stillness of leaves. She remembered the light that afternoon, bright, steady, the woods behind her unmoving in the heat. Maya had laughed easily, asking about old stories their grandmother used to tell. Everything about that hour seemed ordinary until later that night, when Maya replayed the footage. When she did, she froze. At the 18-minute mark, behind where Anita had been sitting, a tall figure stood between the trees. It did not move. The shape was dark, featureless, but clearly solid, the upper outline distinct against the lighter canopy. Anita thought it might have been a shadow at first, some play of light through shifting branches, but the figure remained fixed while the camera trembled slightly in Maya's hands. Frame-by-frame review showed it remained visible for nearly 4 minutes before vanishing between one frame and the next. By tree measurements, it stood more than 8 feet tall. Its limbs appeared long, almost disproportionate, the posture too upright for a bear and too broad for a man. Anita watched the footage twice, then a third time, unable to decide whether she was seeing a trick of light or the shape the elders had warned about. The one said to appear first at a distance, always watching, never retreating. She turned off the laptop and told Maya to delete the file, but by then it had already been copied to her phone. The question that lingered after the screen went dark wasn't what it was. Investigators later asked, how does something that large vanish in a single frame? According to reports, word of Maya's footage spread quickly through the tribal community, reaching Anita before she was ready to face the attention it brought. 2 Cherokee police officers arrived the next afternoon, requesting copies of the recording. Anita watched them move methodically through the property, examining the area where the figure had stood. They pointed to the impressions in the soft earth near the tree line, indentations she had stepped around for days without realizing their significance. Plaster casts were made of several 16-inch footprints that revealed a strange, asymmetrical gait. Anita noticed how the impressions sank deeply at both heel and toe, suggesting something heavy yet balanced, as though whatever made them could move with its full weight upright. The stride between each print measured nearly 4 feet. To her, it looked like a pattern that belonged to neither man nor bear, but something that walked like both. Despite the documentation, the casts were gone within days. Anita learned that wildlife management had taken possession of them, though she did say that she never saw any paperwork confirming that transfer. When she later asked for the case number, the files had already disappeared from the record. What remained were Maya's photographs, the only proof that the prints had existed at all. That night, the rhythmic knocking resumed. Anita marked 3 distinct impacts in her notebook, followed by a deep, dragging exhalation that seemed to press through the bedroom wall. It was the first time she admitted to herself that she was frightened, though she forced her mind to frame it as data. Something to be cataloged, not feared. The disturbances were escalating. Anita felt a growing certainty that their arrival had disrupted something old and watchful, something that had waited for acknowledgement. The Stone Man legend was no longer folklore whispered by elders. It was pressing against her reality. By the second week of June, the property had taken on the atmosphere of a siege. The nighttime sounds followed a strict schedule, every night between 2:45 and 3:10. Anita said that she would wake to 3 heavy knocks from different sides of the house, then silence, then guttural calls that vibrated through the walls with physical force. She documented each sequence, her digital recorder filling with data she could neither explain nor dismiss. When wildlife officers arrived to analyze the recordings, their report only deepened her confusion. The sounds matched no known species in the region and registered at decibel levels, suggesting immense lung capacity. One officer remarked that the calls appeared to be directed toward the Gray Wolf residence, as if in response to something within it. Anita replayed that observation in her head for nights afterward, wondering if something in the valley recognized them specifically. But if it wanted contact, why did it never approach openly? Alongside the sounds came an odor so pungent it seemed alive, a mixture of wet earth and decomposition that saturated the air and vanished at sunrise. Anita noted its presence during every nocturnal disturbance. Maya, increasingly distressed, began sleeping with towels under her door to block the smell, complaining that it caused nausea and headaches. On June 12th, Anita told investigators that she found the chicken coop destroyed at dawn. The wooden frame had collapsed inward, boards splintered but unmarked by claw or bite. There were no tracks in the surrounding dirt, no drag signs, no sign of struggle. The chain-link fencing had been crushed from above as if something immense had dropped onto it. The force required to break the wooden posts at ground level seemed beyond any natural animal. Yet the scene bore no mechanical evidence, no tire marks, no tool impressions. The 6 chickens lay arranged in a straight line 20 feet from the coop. Each neck was broken cleanly, the bodies otherwise untouched. Anita stood over them for several minutes, struck by the absence of chaos. Whatever had done this, it had acted with purpose. 3 days later, during a survey of the property line, she noticed several mature oaks near the abandoned quarry, stripped of bark in clean vertical lines reaching 8 feet up the trunks. The sap was still fresh. When forestry officials inspected the damage, they found no evidence of tools. The bark had been removed in single, fluid motions that implied immense leverage or precision. Reports from nearby ranchers followed the next morning. Deer carcasses had begun appearing in semicircular patterns across the valley, all facing the forest. Anita noted how consistent the arrangement sounded, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The animals showed no sign of disease or predation, their bodies unmarked and intact. Veterinary exams revealed no physiological cause of death. The symmetry of it unsettled her more than the images themselves. Who or what had arranged them with such deliberate symmetry? Technological interference intensified as the pattern continued. Trail cameras deployed by wildlife officers failed within a day, their storage cards corrupted or blank. One managed to capture 6 seconds of usable footage before malfunctioning. When Anita reviewed the clip at the tribal office, she saw a massive silhouette pass close to the lens, so near that the frame blurred from motion. The shape filled the entire shot, yet no features could be discerned. Watching it, she felt the same weight in her chest she had felt that first night, the sense that something vast was studying them in return. The silhouette footage became a point of fixation for researchers, but for Anita, it was something far worse, a confirmation that what had been circling their property had form and intent. Frame-by-frame analyses circulated among cryptozoology circles, showing what appeared to be a bipedal figure of immense proportion with an unnatural gait. She watched those frames repeatedly, noting how the creature seemed to pause and turn toward the camera before the image collapsed into static, as though it had known it was being observed. Anita's documentation changed with that realization. Her once clinical notes, precise and organized, began to unravel into chaotic bursts of handwriting. The early entries were still careful: times, durations, temperature readings, notes about light and sound direction. By mid-June, her writing had become fragmented and urgent, whole lines underlined in heavy strokes, some entries reduced to single declarative phrases written in all capitals, the handwriting trembling with exhaustion and dread. The entry, dated June 14th, stood out most starkly in her own recollection. "It knows we're watching. The sounds are getting closer." Maya drew another picture. Today, how does she know what it looks like? She had not intended to write in that tone, but by then she said that her thoughts had ceased to feel like her own. Maya's sketches were growing disturbingly detailed. Anita noticed the anatomical precision in her daughter's depictions. The elongated limbs, the vast chest, the strange curvature of the shoulders. The eyes in the drawings seemed to hold the page, pale and deliberate, as if some shared vision had guided the pencil. Maya had never seen the creature directly, yet her renderings captured something that made Anita's stomach tighten whenever she looked too long. Anita began to believe the creature was asserting itself, responding to their presence. It moved with deliberation, leaving signs and signals that felt territorial. The Gray Wolf property had become the center of a confrontation decades in the making, and Anita sensed they were now a part of whatever unfinished pattern the valley had been holding. By June 13th, the boundary between observation and participation had dissolved completely. They were no longer witnesses. They were being engaged. The rhythmic pounding that had once seemed distant now shook the entire structure, causing light fixtures to sway and glass to hum in the window panes. Electrical power failed in unison with the pounding, as though each impact drained the air and current at once. The darkness that followed was total, broken only by the pulse of sound surrounding the house in coordinated patterns. But how could something that large perform those without leaving tracks? Her skepticism collapsed quietly rather than dramatically. She now slept on the couch facing the entryway, a claw hammer resting beside her. She positioned herself between the door and Maya's room, sleeping only in short intervals, ears trained on every shift in the wind. Each thud outside felt calculated, as if the thing circling them was not just testing boundaries, but studying them. Maya changed with the pattern of nights. She spoke less, drew more. Her notebooks filled with sequences of the same towering figure, sometimes at the edge of the woods, sometimes half obscured by branches, always turned toward the house. Her focus became unnervingly precise. She would stay awake for hours sketching in silence, her pencil tracing shapes Anita could almost hear. When the wildlife biologists arrived, Anita's hope returned for the first time in weeks. A 3-person team from the Department of Conservation, led by Dr. Ellis Crane, set up on her porch, their confidence measured and professional. Maya recorded the session for her project, while Anita presented her notes, her tone steady as she explained each incident. The destroyed coop, the stripped trees, the symmetrical animal carcasses. She placed her journal before them, offering data she had spent sleepless nights compiling, hoping science might impose structure on the chaos. The scientists' response struck her harder than the knocking ever had. Their calm detachment felt rehearsed. Dr. Crane mentioned isolation hysteria, describing how sensory deprivation could distort perception. His colleague, Dr. Leora Vance, spoke of bacterial infections and environmental contamination, though she admitted that all samples tested clean. Their dismissal of the electromagnetic failures drew the faintest smile from Crane, as though the notion itself insulted his expertise. To Anita, the condescension felt colder than disbelief. That night, their team established a base camp half a mile from the Gray Wolf house. Anita watched their lights fade behind the trees, the equipment glinting under the beam of their headlamps. Motion sensors, infrared rigs, field recorders, electromagnetic detectors arranged with precision and purpose. They moved with the confidence of people who still believed the world was explainable. At 2:30 in the morning, Anita awoke to the sound of static from her handheld radio, followed by a burst of overlapping transmissions. The interference grew dense, layered with low-frequency vibrations that made the walls tremble. Later reports confirmed that the biologists' instruments had all triggered at once: motion sensors, EMF readers, and infrared cameras detecting massive simultaneous movement within a 200-yard radius. The last thing Anita heard before the transmission died was Dr. Crane's voice, distorted by interference, describing something enormous moving between their tents. The signal dissolved into a roar of white noise, leaving the radio silent in her hands. At dawn, tribal police and emergency teams reached the scientists' camp. Anita saw the overturned field truck before they did, half sunk into the clearing. The vehicle had been flipped onto its roof. The frame collapsed inward as though pressed by unimaginable weight. The metal bore deep, rounded impressions, marks that no known tool or natural event could explain. Standing in the wreckage's shadow, Anita understood that whatever had come for them was still nearby, and that its interest had not faded with the night. The three biologists were found unconscious but uninjured approximately 100 yards from their destroyed vehicle. Anita never saw the moment they were discovered, only the aftermath, their faces pale under the emergency floodlights, their movements sluggish and uncertain. They had been lucky, she thought, though none of them looked it. All three suffered from mild hypothermia and temporary memory loss, unable to recall anything beyond the stroke of midnight. Their expensive scientific equipment was strewn across the forest like discarded bones, some pieces embedded in tree trunks 20 feet above ground, as if thrown there by impossible force. Dr. Crane's infrared camera, retrieved by deputies, had captured 47 seconds before dying. Anita watched the playback on a deputy's tablet, numb as the thermal image revealed a towering bipedal shape crossing the campsite at 1:11 in the morning. 8, maybe 9 feet tall. Its heat signature fluctuated strangely, pulsing in uneven waves that no one could explain. She thought of the rhythmic knocking on her own walls, of the heavy breath she sometimes swore she could feel through the floorboards. The creature's heat map glowed and then vanished, replaced by static. Dr. Crane refused to return to Hollow Valley afterward. Anita read his report days later, a single sterile paragraph recommending that the area be closed to researchers. No one mentioned what else might live there. The silence that followed was worse than ridicule. It was abandonment. Back at the Gray Wolf house, the fallout from the scientists' retreat pressed down like a physical weight. Anita understood finally that no one would help them. The decision to leave was immediate, but Maya's plea for one more day, just one more recording, cut deep. She said she was close to proving it existed. Anita had no words left to argue. Against everything maternal in her, she agreed to stay. That night, the smell grew unbearable. It wasn't rot anymore, but something acidic, almost manufactured, seeping through the walls until their eyes burned. Anita sealed every window, dragged furniture against the doors, and refused to step outside. Even the dogs seemed hollowed out, lying together in silence, their ribs trembling with each breath. The air inside the house felt heavy, charged with the same pressure that came before lightning. She could feel it watching, waiting. By June 15th, the valley had turned hostile. Weather alerts warned of severe electrical storms and potential tornadic activity, but Anita barely heard them. She spent the day packing methodically, forcing her hands to move even as static hissed through every device. Radios spat nonsense. Cell signals dissolved into bursts of interference. The air smelled of metal. When the storm hit at 9:37, it sounded like the sky tearing apart. Lightning strobed through the windows, each flash revealing the motionless dogs, the trembling curtains, the outline of the forest beyond. At 9:47, the grid failed. Darkness swallowed the property. Then came the knocking, not the scattered taps of previous nights, but a full assault, measured, powerful, deliberate. The house shuddered as though gripped by unseen hands. Anita felt the floor flex beneath her feet, dishes clattering from shelves, window panes vibrating in rhythm. Somewhere deep inside the structure, something answered each strike with a groan of wood under strain. She grabbed the phone, fighting static, her voice barely rising above the noise. The dispatcher would later note the time, 9:47 and 32 seconds, and the garbled fragments of what she said. The connection pulsed with distortion, each syllable smeared by interference. Anita remembered hearing movement in Maya's room and a heavy step outside, close, circling. The power surged once, flickered, and died. Then that freight train sound roared overhead, a force of wind or something else pressing against the walls. She tried again to speak. The voice that emerged didn't sound like hers. She said something was shaking the house, that Maya was inside, that it was here. The call ended abruptly. Dispatch marked it at 9:49 and 4 seconds, when lightning hit the ridge, blinding white and final. By the time rescuers arrived after midnight, the storm had broken. The door hung open, rain sweeping through the rooms. Furniture lay overturned, glass scattered like salt. Anita's awareness of that night would later fracture into fragments. The smell of ozone, the static still humming in her teeth, and the silence that followed. Outside, they found the tracks. Maya's small footprints running from the porch into the woods, pressed deep into the mud, as though each step had been forced by something close behind. The stride length made no sense for a child. Anita would replay that image forever, those tiny prints vanishing into the trees, chased by something that left only enormous symmetrical impressions on the earth. The search dogs refused to follow. They approached the ridge, then froze, whining and trembling until their handlers dragged them back. Whatever waited beyond that line, even the animals understood they were not meant to cross. The trail ended at a rocky outcropping half a mile from the house, and Anita knew the search was over long before anyone said it. Maya's footprints simply stopped, pressed deep into the soft earth, and then gone, as if the ground itself had swallowed her. There were no signs of a fall, no scuff marks, no drag lines. The larger impressions, the ones that followed, continued for another 50 yards before vanishing on hard stone. She studied the ground until her vision blurred, unable to understand how something that heavy could stop leaving tracks. The official search expanded quickly after that. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating over the valley, while search teams spread through the forest with bright vests and radios that crackled through static. 50 volunteers joined in, calling her daughter's name over and over into the trees. The sound echoed strangely, as if the valley itself refused to return it. For 6 days they searched, through rising heat, rain, and the chemical smell that seemed to linger even after the storm passed. No one found a single trace of Maya beyond that ridge. When the state officials arrived with their reports and explanations, their words barely registered. They said the storm had caused disorientation. They said the terrain was dangerous and that Maya must have fallen somewhere unseen. Anita listened but felt detached from everything, like the conversation was taking place in another room. On June 21, 2015, the search was officially ended. The paperwork said, "Death by misadventure," but Anita could still smell the sour electricity in the air and the damp soil where the prints had stopped. After the searchers left, the silence of Hollow Valley grew unbearable. Anita stayed behind, unable to leave the ridge where the trail ended. She built a small camp from what remained of their supplies, a plastic tarp and the remnants of the storm shelter. Locals later said they saw her wandering at dawn, moving quietly among the trees, keeping watch as if waiting for something to return. She marked each passing night by the sound of distant knocking that no one else seemed to hear. The cold didn't matter. The hunger didn't matter. The ridge had become the last place her daughter existed, and she couldn't abandon it. 3 weeks later, she was found by a county patrol officer, dehydrated and barely conscious. They said she resisted evacuation, insisting she needed to stay where the ground broke off. She was transported to Eastern State Hospital in Veneta, placed under observation in a quiet ward with sealed windows and soft lighting. Investigators visited her frequently in those first days, hoping to piece together what had happened in the woods, but her answers only deepened their confusion. The diagnosis was written in careful medical language, acute stress reaction with psychotic features, but the doctors never understood what she had seen or what she was still listening for at night when she refused to sleep. 5 years passed before anyone found anything tangible. In the summer of 2020, hikers moving through an unmarked section of Hollow Valley discovered skeletal remains scattered near a dry creek bed, over a mile from where the original search had ended. The bones were light, almost bleached by time, and the earth around them had hardened into pale clay. DNA confirmed what Anita had already known since the night of the storm. The remains belonged to Maya Graywolf. The announcement brought no comfort, only the final confirmation that the valley had taken her child and then returned her as proof. The official record lists the case as unresolved, death by misadventure, circumstances undetermined. The language is cautious, bureaucratic, meant to close a file. But the evidence remains. Those impossible tracks, the magnetic interference, the shape burned into a camera's memory. In Anita's mind, the valley still breathes. What happened there was never meant to be explained by the kind of people who write reports. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.